So welcome again to everyone to the October DAT program entitled So You Think You Can Vote. We're very excited to have everybody here. We know there's a great value to these programs, especially learning from our local experts about community issues and history, to be able to ask our questions, and especially this year focusing on practical action steps. And that's going to be absolutely true tonight. For all of you and anybody who eventually is watching the program recorded, we know that while there's going to be specific voting information that has some dates on it, the action steps will continue to apply for all elections, and especially in my position, I am honored to be representing UW-Madison Division of Extension as part of this program collaboration, and my program is community youth development, and so I'm absolutely excited about this program from a youth perspective and being able to continue to share it after we end the recording tonight. So next slide, please, Amy. Just another thank you to all of the partners who continue to collaborate. You can see their names there: Hedberg Public Library, YWCA County, Beloit NAACP, and of course, my organization that I already mentioned. Next. So something that we have decided to add into these slides based on an experience we had over the weekend, and then obviously many conversations before that, is a land acknowledgement statement. For those of you who are not aware, Diversity Action Team has another committee called the Allies of Native Nations, and this is their land acknowledgement statement. So I will read it to all of you. We would like to recognize that we are meeting virtually anyway, on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations, and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I've had the privilege of being in some different workshops who always tell us to try to make this statement as personal as possible. And I know I would not be where I am professionally without this collaboration, although in Central America with my Quiche and Cachiquel colleagues. Next slide, please. For your reminders, these are the same Zoom presentation standards that we ask everyone follow. Questions, remember, we do not unmute during the presentation to ask questions. Please record your questions in the chat. You can send them to everyone, or you can send them to me specifically. There will be time for the Q&A after the presentation. For this presentation, that will include the action steps that we will have represented by our League of Women Voters representative. Please stay muted. If something gets bumped and we recognize it, we'll probably mute you for you. It just helps to make sure that everyone can continue to hear the presenters well. Remember, we are recording the session. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I have the honor to describe a little bit about who will be with us tonight. First, we have Phil Chen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. I'm not going to read the entire slide to you, but of particular interest is the focus on American politics and specialization in political psychology. Next slide. Yep, thank you. And our second presenter is Kate Johnston.
Yeah.
And she will be, and she is an assistant professor of history also at Beloit College. Her research teaches about race, slavery, and the environment in the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. I believe we will also have a specific focus from her on the Native North American lens tonight. Next slide, Amy. And our action steps will be presented by Lisa Johnson, representing the League of Women Voters. This is just a brief slide describing that organization, but Lisa will go into depth when we get to her section of the program. Amy, I believe you can stop sharing that slide deck, and Kate will be taking over. to begin our wonderful
Hello,
presentation.
everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I actually do have some slides that I was going to share and realized that I also have my notes on my screen and no printer. So I have actually emailed those slides to Amy and to Phil in case one of them is able to share them. Otherwise, when I get to them, I can share them because it's not the whole thing. But if one of them wants to share, otherwise I will be talking to you here. So I mostly wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here and thank you for asking me to speak. I just wanted to give a brief rundown about some of the obstacles people have faced in voting in this country. So if we go back to the Constitution, ratified in 1788, we have this sort of uncertain time, right? Pre-Constitution, we have colonies. All the colonies established their own rules as to who could vote. And a lot of them had to do with property qualifications and or religious tests. So you had to pass certain religious tests in order to be able to vote in some colonies, as well as have property qualifications. This carried over into the Constitution where the religious part was left out, but the property qualifications remained. So that basically it remained divided because states, not colonies, could establish their own rules for establishing who got the vote. Most of them restricted them to white property owning men, which was only about 6% of the entire population. There were a few exceptions. In some colonies, women could vote. Some colonies, free Black men could vote. But in the following years and decades, these rights were actually taken away from people who were not white men. And the white men who could vote, it expanded. So it expanded from just property owning this 6% of people to more and more white men, even as it's taken away from other people who are not white men. So that's sort of the foundational voting rights, right? So we start with colonies in 17th century, 18th century, we get through the Constitution, and by the time of the Civil War, really, it's about most white men could vote, but anyone else could not. So as Erin said, I wanted to talk a lot about some of the issues with Native people. But first, right, one of the most important things in 1870, we have the 15th Amendment that allowed Black men to vote. And it, in theory, right, prohibited the federal government and the states from denying citizens the right to vote based on their race or their skin color. And this was supposed to be all men could vote, right? This is in theory. In practice, this does not happen at all. So in some cases, there are, mostly in the South, states start requiring voters to take unreasonable literacy tests, which we can get into in a little bit. They also had to pay poll taxes. These were intended explicitly to keep people of color from participating in elections. In addition, you had violent intimidation, right? So you had hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan going to polls, going to people's houses, telling people, threatening them that, you know, with their lives if they were to vote. And so this kind of serious violent intimidation, and sometimes carrying out these threats, right, really kept African-American men from voting. They didn't want to go if they had these threats to their lives. And there were basically, so I want to leave that aside for a minute. And that's kind of continuing basically almost as soon as we have the 15th Amendment. This starts happening. So I wanted to talk a bit about women, and the slide you see is this when I'm starting to talk about this, in part because, as you know, this is the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, or the ratification of it. So women began agitating for the vote throughout the 19th century, right? This is happening all along. And they're getting nowhere, they're getting nowhere, they're getting nowhere. They're agitating, they're getting more supporters, right? But nothing is happening in terms of politics. So starting around 1910, these increase in intensity. So you see in this first slide, you see these marches, right? These marching for the vote. And this became a way of really being visible, being vocal. You can see the crowds that are drawn to marches like this. This was the way that women started being really vocal about this. And I appreciate, I think probably Phil, who's sharing this. You can go to the next slide. I just wanted to talk about these slides for a minute, or it could be Amy, but whoever's doing it, thank you. So these are, especially in the beginning, these are really multiracial coalitions of women. So here you have a picture of women of color who are saying, this is what we're doing, right? They're holding this banner for voting. They're a big part of this. And the next slide, so I'm going to go through these slides really pretty quickly, right? This is Ida B. Wells Barnett from Illinois. She's instrumental in organizing Black women in these voting parades. And they're really a huge part of the organization. And this is driven in large part by women of color, as well as white women, but women of color are playing a big role in this. So I think I have like 3 more slides, maybe. The next one, this is, well, actually a few more. So this one you can kind of see, it's hard to tell, but this is a parade in Boston, and there's white women, there's women of color, there's a bunch of different women in this parade, but it's drawing large crowds, right? This is really a multiracial thing. So, but by the next slide, the white women decided that the best way to actually get the 19th Amendment passed, right, to get the right to vote, was to portray this movement as being not multiracial, as being non-threatening in any way, right? So they decide that the best way to do this is to have white, feminized women who were obviously just going to vote with their husbands, and they were married, they were highly feminine, that this was the way to get this amendment passed. So it turns into this white women's right? And so the next slide, I think, would be great. So you also had women who were Native, Indigenous women who were a big part of this, and they were pushing to get the right to vote. And so, right, this is Zitkala Sa. She's a really important figure in this. So basically what happens is, in 1919, Congress approves the 19th Amendment, sends it to the states for ratification. By the way, Wisconsin's the first state to ratify it, June 10th, 1919. The following year, 1920, it gets the votes it needs for ratification, and a bunch of women voted, right? Millions of women voted in the November election that year. They were almost exclusively white women, because women of color continued to be denied the right to vote. So with the Indigenous people, it becomes really complicated, because they're members of their own nations. And originally the federal government recognized their sovereignty in the Constitution, and they technically honored that sovereignty through making treaties, even though they often ignored the treaties. But for legal purposes, they're sovereign until the government says in 1871, you know what? They're all gonna either die out or become assimilated, and so we're no longer gonna honor them as separate nations. So in 1884, Congress says only an act of Congress can endow them with US citizenship, Native people. So they lose all political power. They're dependent wards of the state. They have no sort of tribal authority because their government's not recognized. They have no power to vote in terms of the federal US government. So all of these political things are happening in the late 19th century. Their land is all divided up. They are considered wards of the state. And so they start, and some people who had registered to vote, their states drop their names from all rolls. And they do complex things, right? So they say, oh, you have to re-register with a deputy registrar, but a deputy registrar has to be a tax-paying resident of a local district, and they can't be a member of Native community. And so these Native communities didn't have a local registrar, so they couldn't register to vote. So basically all of these states start using various tactics by saying, well, you're not a citizen of this, so you can't vote for this. And you need a specific requirement. So as their wardship begins to expire, there's all of this division sowed because the government decides who can be a ward, who can be a citizen, and it's based upon blood, right? They're like, if you're full-blooded Indigenous, you are still a ward of the state. And so they start becomes really unclear who is allowed to vote and who's not allowed to vote, who's a citizen and who's not. So these Native feminists, right, this is Sitka Kalasa, she fought back, right? So this was, she says, look, I helped you white women with the suffragist movement. Now we need your help trying to get our recognition so that we can actually vote too. Next slide shows one other person, right? Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. She's of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. Incidentally, she became one of the first Native women to graduate from law school in 1914. But basically, she's fighting because all of this land is broken up. And so you have all this massive land loss. And the United States said, we will assign certain parcels of land to certain people, but they have to be men, and we're holding it in trust. So essentially, these Indigenous women who had fought for the vote, they were excluded from the vote, as were most Indigenous men. And they continued this activism, and they, as well as, so it becomes really complicated, right? And I know I don't have a lot of extra time to go into it, but I wanted to just talk very briefly about these tests that were given to people who were both Indigenous as well as African American. So some states implemented various different kinds of literacy tests. Some of you who have heard Professor Ron Watson talk about them maybe before. There's the Louisiana one, which is really famous, which I'll talk about briefly in a second. Other states had literacy tests, like you had to know really obscure state laws. And so they'd say, you have to pass this test where you can answer these questions about who holds positions of power politically, locally, federally. What is this really obscure law? I mean, these were really ridiculous tests with a high bar in order to just vote for anything. So Louisiana had a particularly interesting one where they basically asked all kinds of questions. So I think my last slide is next, and it's just the last few questions of the Louisiana literacy test. And you can kind of see how ridiculous they are. So some of these questions are just nonsensical. If you look at 29, I've read this question so many times and don't understand it. Write every other word in this first line and print every third word in same line. Original type smaller and first line ended at comma, but capitalize the fifth word that you write. And that is exactly what it says. And so they are impossible to pass. You have 30 questions, you have 10 minutes. If you do the math, that's 20 seconds per question. And that's with no time on either end to kind of read and do all this stuff. So I will end in, I have about 30 more seconds. I will just say that these kinds of questions were designed to have people fail. And they were far, far, far disproportionately applied to people of color across the board. And right, so one piece of victory, 1965, the Voting Rights Act outlawed these literacy tests. It outlawed poll taxes, it outlawed other discriminatory laws. And so these kinds of things were no longer in place. It does not mean, right, that voting has always been easy for everyone or is even easy for everyone now. We know that there continue to be problems, but I'm going to turn it over to Phil Chen now and just leave some of the rest of this for later.
Thanks, Kate. Let me get my thing shared here. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. Well, Kate's done good work there for me because she's taken me right up to the point where I was hoping to be, which is talking about the Voting Rights Act. And I'm gonna step back a little bit because the literacy tests are a really nice transition for me. I'm gonna talk about the Voting Rights Act sort of very briefly and then step us through the sort of contemporary challenges. So most of my stuff will be post 1965, and especially looking at some of the research that we have now on things like voter ID and gerrymandering and things like that. And give me a wave if I go. I don't think I'm going to go over time, but give me a wave if I do. But literacy tests, like I said, are a useful jumping off point for me because, as Kate said, they aren't simply a way to ensure basic knowledge. What they are is they are arbitrarily administered by white poll workers, right? So not only are they more likely to be given to Black voters or Native voters or people of color who come in to vote, it's also that the way they were administered by white poll workers was discriminatory. So if a white person comes in to vote, they can say, here's your ballot or here's your literacy test, go over to the side, take your literacy tests with all those other white people over there, feel free to talk, come back, they can look at it, they say, great, you passed, go. They don't have to grade it. Black person comes in, they say, here's your test, send them off there, say, don't talk to anyone, you have to do it yourself, you have 10 minutes, come back. They say, no, you only got 8 of 10 right, sorry, you can't vote. What it does is it shifts the burden of administration down to what we call street level bureaucrats. And that's going to be important because we see that coming up today in things like voter identification. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. So I like literacy tests as a way to sort of branch into this because we're seeing the same challenges that for people of color voting during the sort of post-Reconstruction, pre-Voting Rights Act era as we see today. Now, of course, the Voting Rights Act from 1965 is essentially that enforcement mechanism for the 15th Amendment. It says there are, dozens of states, counties, and cities all across the country that have been discriminating against Black voters, not just Black voters, Indigenous voters, Hispanic voters, but largely the original coverage formula dealt with Black voters in the South with a few exceptions. The key provisions, right, outlawed literacy tests, reiterated that language of the 15th Amendment, also actually noted that you can also not discriminate based on language, which is, I think, important for part of the coverage. And then the sort of important part is what was called the coverage formula. Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act sets up what's called the pre-clearance coverage formula. And it says, on November 1st, 1964, did your jurisdiction use a test or a device that prohibited voting or registration, right? So was there some law in place that allowed for discrimination? And were either less than half of your eligible citizens registered to vote, or less than half had voted in the last presidential election? So the pre-clearance formula says, okay, if you meet one of these criteria, you have to clear any voting law changes with the federal government prior to making those changes. So everything on this map that is not beige is covered in some sense by the Section 5, the coverage, and Section 4, the coverage formula. So whole states in the South, and then counties or townships, depending in a variety of places. And you'll notice those two counties in South Dakota are not discriminating against Black people, but rather discriminating against Indigenous voters. And that's why they fall under the pre-clearance formula of the Voting Rights Act. And it turns out the Voting Rights Act works, right? Through the end of 1965, so from August 6th through the end of 1965, there are 750,000 new Black voters who become registered to vote. And a third of those are directly registered by federal examiners. So federal examiners go into these covered jurisdictions, check to make sure they're complying with the Voting Rights Act, and can register voters directly, which is a change because we don't have a federal registration system. So normally states do this, but in this case, the federal examiners are in there, and we see a huge influx of registrations for Black voters. And then again, anything those states want to do as far as changing their voting laws, they have to clear either with the DC District Court or through the Attorney General's office. Specifically, it's now delegated to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And almost all changes go through the administrative process rather than the courts, because the litigation is expensive and it's a simple application process to go through the administrative form. Of course, this fight isn't over, right? The Voting Rights Act has been sort of, the formula was sort of continually renewed every time there was sort of updates to the Voting Rights Act. It was originally scheduled to expire in 5 years, and towards the end of the 60s, they said, no, still a problem. We're gonna keep doing this. They just kind of kept doing that. 2006, they extended it for 25 years, I believe. But slowly, and then all in one fell swoop in 2013, we saw a chipping away at voting rights. So 2016, we saw Evanwell v. Abbott, which was a challenge to one person, one vote. Essentially said, okay, we'd like to draw our districts not by population, but by voting eligible population. So excluding children, non-citizens, anyone who's ineligible to vote. Supreme Court said, no, can't do that. So that one, relatively safe. The citizenship questions that we see appearing on the US Census, that is something that public opinion pollsters, as well as us as political science, know was designed to depress response rates. And thus, if you can't draw districts based off of voting eligible population, like Evanwell v. Abbott was arguing, then you can just reduce the count of non-citizens. And that's what that question could absolutely do. Of course, that was not, it ended up not being included on the census in 2020, which as a methodologist is a really good, I think is a really good thing if you want a good count. So all of this is part of this. But then of course, the big elephant in the room was 2013 Shelby County v. Holder, where the Supreme Court essentially said the pre-clearance formula, right? The thing that said you had to, if you met the requirements on November 1st, 1964. The Supreme Court says that formula is outdated. It's unconstitutional. You cannot, that formula, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, is unconstitutional. They don't strike down the whole Voting Rights Act, but they strike down the formula. What that means is any state that normally would have had to clear their changes, now we're free to make any changes to voting laws without clearing them with the Civil Rights Division. And states, not unexpectedly, quickly moved to implement new laws like voter ID laws. Now, the court leaves open the possibility of Congress passing a new and updated formula. Republican Congress is unlikely to pursue this. It is generally thought to be a part of many of the Democratic voting proposals. So you might see, if there's Democratic control, unified Democratic control, you might see this come up, a new coverage formula being talked about. But I want to talk more about those sort of contemporary challenges. Voter ID laws are a big one, though a more complex one than I think a lot of people think. I'm going to talk about why gerrymandering might be problematic, and then some newer challenges that we don't really have academic work on yet, but that I think will be useful to consider. So, quick primer. Voter ID laws, right? Laws that require an individual to show their identification in order to vote. Usually we talk about photo identification, not always true. In Wisconsin, you have to show a photo identification or one of a few other kinds, but most places that have these laws require photo ID, but it could be just any form of identification. But again, the big issue with voter ID laws is the application of the law. How is the law applied? So we've I say fixed, but we have at least eliminated many of the overtly racist policies that we've had. Things like all white primaries, right? Primaries that said, well, okay, Black people can vote in the general election, but only white people can vote in the party primaries. So you're not going to have a choice of who to vote for. You're going to have to vote for our candidates, right? Even if we fix those problems, which the many court cases and law changes and then the Voting Rights Act fixed the overtly racist policies, we still have that problem of street level bureaucrats, right? Voter ID laws are similar to literacy tests in that they are ostensibly race neutral, right? You look at it, you look at the law, it doesn't say anything about race. It's not explicitly racialized in nature, but they're still administered differently. And so what we've seen, this is a study that was done in New Mexico. The average New Mexico voter had about a 69% chance of getting asked for their identification, for photo ID when they went to vote. So about 7 in 10 chance of getting asked to vote. If you are a Hispanic voter, you have an 85% chance of getting asked for your ID. And if you're a Hispanic male voter, you have a 92% chance of getting asked, right? The law gives discretion to poll workers, and the poll workers are then implementing the law in a racially biased manner. The sort of complicating factor of this is that it does not appear to be about any kind of characteristic of the poll worker, right? Being a Republican or a Democrat doesn't change the likelihood that you will show this kind of bias. Being white doesn't change the likelihood of exhibiting this bias. In their study, all of the poll workers were equally likely to discriminate in this manner. So the chance of being ID'd simply goes up with being in this case, Hispanic male voter. So we have sort of unequal application of the laws, and we also have things like disparate impact, right? So we see what happens. Here's another study from Matt Barretto done in Indiana. And here, instead of looking at how the law is applied, they're looking at who has access to an acceptable identification. And I think not surprisingly, given what we know about the interplay of race and class in the United States, Black people are disadvantaged, right? Black people are less likely to have a valid identification. Low socioeconomic status, so poor people are more likely to be disadvantaged. Young people and old people are more likely to be disadvantaged, right? This should sound familiar if we're paying attention to a lot of what we've seen in American politics these days. But the tricky part for Indiana is that it's also partisan in nature. So Democrats, controlling for all of these other factors, Democrats are also less likely to have acceptable identification in Indiana. And Barreto doesn't get into the specifics of why that's the case, but it gives it's interesting because from a political perspective, it means that the Republican Party can argue that the law is not discriminatory based on race. It's discriminatory based on partisanship. And that is treated very differently in the law than racial discrimination. So all this is to say, if all of these costs and all the applications were randomly distributed in the population, we probably would care less, right? It's not a great thing if people are being disenfranchised. It's not a great thing if people don't have access to identification. But if it's truly randomly distributed, if it's literally drawn out of a hat random, it's not going to affect representation. It's not going to affect the way that the outcome of elections. But it appears from the evidence that there are clear systematic biases, both in how the laws are applied and in who has access to these forms of identification. So voter ID, one of the big pieces, and of course, as we talked about, poor people, minorities, non-English speakers, young people, old people, people with disabilities. These are where the major costs fall from voter identification. I'm going to skip through this and go to gerrymandering because I don't want to run out of time here. Gerrymandering is one of those things where I like to talk about it when we're talking about voting because it doesn't seem, on its face, people will say, well, okay, but what district I'm drawn in doesn't affect whether I vote or not. But I'm gonna say it actually might, and in fact, we think it does. So again, gerrymandering, essentially drawing districts to favor one group over another. When we've done this, historically it was done in around race. That is illegal. That has been roundly struck down by the Supreme Court. Now what we see a lot of is partisan gerrymandering, essentially drawing districts to favor one party or the other and make seats essentially not competitive. So cracking and packing are the two things that we talk about. Cracking being taking blocks of voters. So if you have a block of Republican voters, you could put them all in one district and give them some power, or you might say, I'm going to split these voters up into 3 different districts and really dilute the voting power that they have. So you can split key groups, or you can pack as many of that group into one district as you want and give them sort of an overwhelmingly partisan district. Now, of course, the issue is that you end up with a whole lot of really safe seats for your opposition, or a few really safe seats for your opposition, and a lot of sort of marginally safe seats for yourself. I like to say the risk is asymmetrical. If you draw we can take Wisconsin as an example, right? Wisconsin has 8 congressional districts. 2 are clearly democratically drawn, right? Drawn to always elect a Democrat. Mark Pocan and Gwen Moore will win if they want to win. Their challengers are not, there's no real challenge there. Even in a hugely Republican favored environment, neither one of them is really at risk of losing their seat. But in a very strong Democratic environment, several of the other districts could become more competitive. And that's what I mean by the risk is asymmetrical. But the parties are willing to take that risk because they have leeway. It lets them win the House without winning the popular vote, which is what happened in 2012, right? The Republicans lost the popular House vote, but won the House anyway. we talk about it often, also gerrymandering or district drawing, when we talk about minority candidates. One of the big things that we do is we draw what are called majority minority districts. And so these are districts where the majority of the residents are non-white. The idea is we want to draw districts that will encourage descriptive representation. So representation by non-white people. So we want to make it so that non-white people have a chance to win election to Congress. And in fact, these are legally required in many jurisdictions. Now, the trick is that you used to need about a 60 to 70% advantage or majority of minority voters in a district to ensure minority representation. It was different by location, but essentially you had a lot of white partisans who were willing to vote for the other party instead of voting for a non-white candidate of their own party. And so that's why you needed greater than 50% in order to ensure a district would elect a minority member of Congress. Turns out that's no longer the case. We have intense political polarization now, which means while, especially in the South, white Democrats used to not want to vote for candidates of color, that's simply not the case anymore. White Democrats are far more likely to vote for a Democrat, regardless of race, than for any Republican, and that's vice versa true as well. What that means is that majority minority districts are actually not necessary anymore. What we really need is districts drawn, the expectation is around 40-ish% of the district needs to be minority, about a 40% minority district in order to ensure the election of a minority candidate, because you have such strong political polarization at this point. And yet the districts are still being drawn at 60, 70, 80% at times majority minority, which means you're packing in more and more minority voters into a district and really concentrating their power, but not allowing them to have a greater voice and a greater say in other surrounding districts. And that's one of the big issues with these majority minority districts, is not that they aren't necessary, but that they're being exploited to concentrate power in a few districts rather than allowing that power to spread to other districts. Like I said, there is a relation to voting here, though, which is people are more likely to vote if they think their vote matters. And so as gerrymandering has happened, it's created more and more non-competitive seats. And what that means is we're seeing less and less turnout in those elections. We see this also at the presidential level. Presidential swing states have significantly higher turnout than states that are not competitive. Essentially, people don't vote as frequently when they don't feel like their vote matters. And that's a real problem, as we're starting to see this with gerrymandering. Finally, and I promise I'm wrapping up here, the sort of new challenges that I think we're a little too soon to have any good academic work on, but things that I think we have reason to expect that might be problematic moving forward. One of the things, absentee balloting, theoretically a great thing to increase access to voting. But the other thing we know that we're seeing already is that it increases the rate of what we call spoiled ballots. Essentially, you have to jump through hoops, you have to sign it, you often have to have a witness. And what we also know is that those kinds of the errors that happen on absentee ballots are more likely to come among groups that have traditionally been less likely to use absentee ballots. Poor people, minorities, these are groups that have traditionally not been targeted by the parties for absentee ballot programs and thus have less experience with them. And so it's not about poor people and minorities being worse at absentee voting, it's that they have not been brought into the process by the parties the same way white and upper class people have been. And so with experience comes the knowledge of how to cast a ballot without spoiling your ballot. So absentee balloting, great if it works, possibly, in fact, we're seeing more and more evidence that we have high rates of spoiled ballots. Distrust of the Postal Service, right? institutional trust is vital, right? We know it's vital for things like the Supreme Court, for Congress, for the presidency. It's also true of institutions, right? And what we're seeing is we're already seeing things like Democrats are becoming less trusting of the Postal Service because they view it as becoming politicized under DeJoy. And so what we're seeing is that this is likely to lead to a drop off in the use of mail-in voting. And we're already seeing that effect, right? You saw a big push for mail-in voting early in the summer and during the pandemic. We're now seeing a lot more people saying, drop off your ballot, don't put it in the mail, go do in-person absentee. You know, if you have to vote on the day, don't trust the mail. And so, you know, I think we'll have to, again, there's no real research on this yet, but we know that distrust is going to decrease reliance and use of these systems. Polling places are being closed or consolidated. Beloit just saw that as well. Some of it is state and local budget cuts, right? As well as the pandemic is just getting less money into state and local coffers. There are fewer poll workers. But we know that when people don't have familiarity with their polling places, they are less likely to go vote. So it's similar to what we see when people move, right? The longer you live in a location, the more likely you are to vote because you know your polling place, you know your way around the neighborhood, you know when, you know, where you go to vote, how you get in there. So as polling places move or are closed or consolidated, we're likely to see those kinds of effects reproduce and pass down through the system. And that is kind of where I'm going to leave off. I threw a lot of different things at you, but I think the big piece to me is we may have solved some of our sort of overtly or abjectly racist and sexist laws, but that doesn't change the fact that laws today are still being applied in discriminatory manners.
So thank you, Kate and Phil. Remember, if anyone has questions to ask them, write them in the chat or send them to me directly. Tonight, we do have the opportunity for a speaker to be talking about our action steps, and that is Lisa Johnston from the League of Women Voters. So we will move into that piece now. Thank you, Amy, for getting those right up there.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Johnston, and I'm a voter service chair for the Janesville League of Women Voters. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has been a nonpartisan activist group, grassroots organization that believes voters should play a critical role in our democracy. The League consists of 700 plus state and local leagues with over 500,000 members. The long and the short of it is our mission is clear. We're all about empowering voters and defending democracy. But so we are in the middle of an election and in challenging times with a pandemic. What are we to do? If you'd change the slide, please. What can we do? My advice is keep it simple, plan, and don't stress out. There are a lot of obstacles that we can overcome and hopefully will bring about change over time. But number one is it's critical to get out the vote. Turnout is just paramount. Stay one step ahead of the roadblocks and obstacles in voting and never, ever give up. Number two, get the facts, know the rules of the game. I listed several outlets or resources that are outstanding resources if you have questions about the rules. The Wisconsin Election Commission oversees all of the county and city clerk's offices who are officers of the election. You can check with the League of Women Voters website. We have a lot of material there. The DMV number information is there. And most of all, maybe most importantly, rely on our city clerks in Janesville and Beloit, county clerk, Lisa Tollefson. These people are public servants. dedicated to helping us vote and making sure we have a fair election. Change the slide. The next slide, I just want to focus on, if we, oh, we scooted ahead. That's just a slide. Okay, let's go back a couple. Okay, that white piece in the middle is all I want you to take a peek at. It's a toll-free number that is a hotline for almost like a customer service number on voting questions out of Dane County. Our league subscribed to that group also to help support it. If you like to talk to people by phone, those people are in the know. If you change the slide. The next slide shows the myvote.wi.gov, an extremely user-friendly site. You can go in, put your personal information if you haven't been in there. It'll ask you to identify yourself. It tells you where you vote, where the polls are for you. It'll show you your ballot. And most of all, if you did do absentee ballot, it will step you through the whole progression of asking for the absentee ballot. It'll show that when they send it to you and when you returned it. And I would encourage everyone, if they have this website and they have voted absentee, to go out and check for your ballot being received. And if it's been longer than 2 weeks, I would call your city clerk's office and ask them, you sent it in, if you did it by mail, or even if you dropped it off, just make sure the board is being received. It's all over ballot they sent you absentee-wise, who they sent it to, and it's tracked. So it's a very simple way to make sure your vote has been received. Next slide. Quick touch on Vote 411. This was the first year in Rock County that we or supported that for Rock County candidates. And essentially, if you've not been out there, it's the league comes up with 3 or 4 general questions that pertain to the race. And we request that the candidates answer the questions, and we upload their responses to the questions verbatim. And it gives you a side-by-side look at how they may differ on different points that have to do with their position. Next slide. Another slide on, if you could change the slide one more time. Back one. I think we're one too far. Okay. What else can we do? This is kind of a key point, that it's how we can all get involved and be responsible. First of all, try to encourage people to go to reputable sources for their information on candidates and issues. Educate others about the importance of voting. I think some people are discouraged about all the obstacles that are out there, and I'm going to touch on 2 in a second. But we can't be discouraged. We can't give up, because that's part of the opposition's practice. Educate others on how to vote. The league stands ready if you talk to your employer and there's a possibility that maybe you could have some in-service kind of training on your staff, for example, on how to vote. Are they ready to vote? The league would be happy to help either train the inside group, like if it's an HR department, or committee members, or even come to your site and help with getting people ready to vote, how to register, etc. Next slide. Next slide. We're too far again. All right. Key dates that are remaining. Oh, here's just some media sources to give you an idea that this is from all sides. The 4 columns or 5 columns represent far left, a little left from center, center, and right and far right. Publications and resources that and how they kind of present themselves. Next slide. There are 2 things, last things I want to talk about. A few words on voter suppression before I get to the remaining dates. We can't be discouraged. They're planting seeds of fear are being sown as we speak on the legitimacy of our election. It is common in the United States for members of political parties, candidates, representatives, advocates for nonpartisan groups, and others to observe the process. It's called poll watching by people properly trained and certified. However, there have been calls for supporters of some candidates to go to the poll and watch very carefully. State and local officials must, and we hope will, ensure that safeguards are in place to protect the rights of Americans to cast their ballots. There's been talk of factions that are dispatching law enforcement officers, sheriff's attorney generals to polling places, and they're calling for a large number of people to call in a call to action. We're hoping that officials and voting right advocates are stressing the need for voters not to allow these comments to deter them from voting. Election protection volunteers will be out in full force and try to stop voter intimidation as it is against the law. And officials indicate they're prepared to enforce the law. We must be vigilant but not fearful. The goals of voter suppression and voter intimidation are often accomplished by just sowing fear. The answer to this threat is rather simple. Vote, vote, vote. If you're unable to vote early, if you're able to vote early, vote early. If you're able to vote in person, vote in person, but vote whatever way is best for you. And one last comment is on democracy is worth waiting for. There's a lot of prediction about how the 2020 election will play out this November, but one thing is most certain, we're probably not going to have results on election night, and that's okay, in my opinion. And we will be fine. This year, we're going to have to wait for democracy to run its course. We will also need to demand that our candidates and media wait as well. As American voters, we have become accustomed to learning our election outcomes on the same day we cast our ballot, or in some cases, even before the polls close. However, I don't think that's what's going to happen in this election. The U.S. Postal Service continuously plays a critical role in the electoral process of all election cycles. We must trust them to do the job. They are equipped and ready, but there still could be obstacles. But because of all the ballots that are being mailed, additional time is needed to get the counting done. But let's think this through. We want to complete and accurate local, state election results. So if we're waiting while ballots are counted instead of rushing, we won't learn the election outcome until after November 3rd. But it means our system is working. It means that everyone's vote will be counted and their voice heard. We are facing new challenges in our election system, but our democracy already has the solutions needed to preserve and succeed. If we take our time, and we can still ensure election rights and access and accuracy for all voters. After all, our democracy is worth it. And the very last slide hits some key dates. We're beyond the registration online now. That ended yesterday, but these slides will break down the rest of the process until we get to the election. But we still can register. We can't do it online any longer. There are people in the clerk's office ready to help. We have open voting in the city clerk's office starting on the 20th for 10 days. That ends on the 30th. There's lots of opportunities. So get out the vote, folks. And thanks for your attention.
Actually, Amy, I'll take that youth focus slide back up in this part too before we change. The slide after the key dates, could I have that one up? Thank you. One of my key interests on being a part of this program was to also provide the next steps with a youth lens. Again, these are being recorded, and it's possible to be sharing this information that was shared tonight with youth. And it's just as important to encourage them to be active, to encourage them to learn how to select from reputable nonpartisan resources, to learn the histories that Phil and Kate shared with us tonight, and be able to be advocates. So here on this slide are many options, and because this is a recording, any of you can access this and come back and look at it at different times, but we wanted to make sure that this piece and this audience was also included in the content for this evening. And I'll take the next slide too, Amy, right now. We'll do this and then we'll wrap around to stop the recording. So just so that the announcements and everything are contained here, before we go to Q&A, our Q&A has run a little bit over this evening, but we hope you'll stay with us. So remember, the recording of the program will be posted on the Hedberg Public Library YouTube channel in the net. I have note that says 72 hours, which is pretty fast. You can always check the DAT website or partner Facebook pages for upcoming events and registration. Obviously, we will have our November program entitled We're Still Here, focusing on Native Americans and their current context. I know there are some other future events of interest that Amy is going to mention.
So the YWCA has our Racial Justice Conference coming up. So please mark your calendars for November 12th, which is a Thursday. So registration is now open. You can visit our website. I will drop the link in the comments section. From now until the end of the month, that price is $75. Once we hit November 1st, it does go up to $100. So if you're thinking about registering, now is definitely the time to do it. And also on next Monday, YWCA Rock County, in conjunction with Diversity Action Team and Community Action, will be hosting Courageous Conversations. So that always happens on the 4th Monday of the month. So we're hoping that you will join us. This month, we are thinking that our theme will focus on the She session and how Black and Latino women have been greatly impacted by that.
Okay, thank you. And I know there was one other announcement who asked for permission to share, and that was Ellen Joyce. If you'd like to unmute and share that event, you can do that also.
Thank you. I don't want to take away from the question time, but there's a movement around the state right now to have Get Out the Vote car caravans on October 24th, Saturday. And some members of the Beloit League and also Linda Reinhardt from the League of Women Voters in Janesville have been talking about organizing local events. In Beloit, we want to have an event starting at 10 o'clock on October 24th, leaving from the parking lot on West Grand Avenue across from the Episcopal Church, across from St. Paul's. I can't remember the exact address. Look for more details. I'll get some out on the DAT listserv. The idea is to decorate our cars with nonpartisan signs encouraging people to vote. We'll do a circuit of the periphery of the Beloit Farmers Market and then go through neighborhoods on the west and east side. If Linda's here, she might want to, this will be sponsored in part by the League of Women Voters in Beloit. I also hope to use the networks of Justice Overcoming Borders, if Ruth Kolpak is still on the call, and the Indivisible group in Beloit. So mark your calendars and look for further details on Get Out the Vote activities on Saturday, October 24th. I'm hoping that a similar event can be organized in Janesville in the afternoon, but I haven't talked to Linda about that recently. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Mary also had one announcement, and again, I'm allowing these on the recording because we don't know when people will be watching this. Also, I think whenever you watch the recording, it's important to know these events go on so that you look for them in the future. So go ahead, Mary.
Thank you. The Janesville American Association of University Women and the Janesville League of Women Voters are co-hosting a program on Tuesday, October 27th from 7 to 8. It is, again, on Zoom. This one's about gerrymandering. So I know Phil Chen talked a little bit about gerrymandering. So if you wanted to learn more about it, also what you as a citizen can do to try and change the issues of gerrymandering, please join us. If you go to the Janesville League of Women Voters website, which is www.lwvjvl.org, and then go to the event, scroll down to the events, you will find the button for RSVP. We will send you a Zoom code for the October 27th, 7 p.m. gerrymandering program.
Thank you. And Mary, feel free to put that website in the chat. That might be helpful for people too. So that's going to conclude the official part of our program. I'll ask Amy to stop the recording.